Hi, Dr. Versalati here, and in this screencast we're going to talk about morphemes. Our learning objectives for today are to understand the linguistic concept of morpheme by recognizing constituents that have the same meaning, the same or very similar form, and the same use. And we're going to apply those concepts of form, meaning, and use to identify separate morphemes or individual morphemes. Now, what's a morpheme? Well, Finnegan gives two different definitions. One is just the meaningful elements of a word, and that seems logical, it seems understandable. And in the glossary of Finnegan's book, morpheme is described as the smallest linguistic unit that carries meaning or serves a grammatical function. So I think we can understand those individual words, but how do we identify morphemes in English or in any language? One thing to think about is to think about how all of language can be described as a combination of meaning, expression, which is form, and context. So meaning, we would expect a morpheme to have the same meaning, a consistent meaning, and the morpheme would also have a consistent form, or at least very closely related forms. And it would be used, or it would show up in the same way, in the same places in the language. So let's look at some examples. We have the word apologize and apologize with two different spellings. One is the US spelling and one is the British spelling. If we wanted to break these two words, maybe we want to think of them as the same word, but for a moment we're just going to compare them. If we're going to break those into morphemes, it would probably look something like this, right? We would have the word or the stem apology, and we would have this ending eyes or eyes. Remembering that a morpheme, if we're going to try to identify it, we're going to ask if it has the same meaning. Yes, we think that these two suffixes have the same meaning, and it's obviously in the same context. It's right there on the same stem, and the question is, is this a consistent form? Well, we do say them the same, and the spelling's a little bit different, but it's very similar. In linguistics, we really focus more on the sound than the spelling, but this was just an easy example to show. So let's go to a more complicated example. So we have apologize, categorize, emphasize, and advertise. Here, these are all US spellings, but again, we want to ask, how would we identify if that suffix at the end of all of these words, or if this represents the same morpheme or maybe different morphemes? Again, let's consider the meaning, expression, and form. Well, what do you think the meaning of this suffix might be? Well, if you have an apology, to apologize means to make an apology. So there's some sort of idea, and same with category. If you categorize, you put things in categories. So it's some sort of making meaning. And we've already talked about that the context, well, we can ask if the context is the same. Apology is a noun, category is a noun, emphasis is a noun, advert is a noun, at least in British English. And then again, I think we've already answered that these seem to be the same form, or at least similar enough, because they're pronounced the same. So what we could say is that this is the same morpheme, and how it derives other words is if you have noun and you add the suffix "eyes," which has a consistent meaning of something to do with to make the noun, and the resulting word is a verb. Okay, let's try these three words, which maybe are a little bit more difficult. First, take a moment and separate these into morphemes. Maybe what you've come up with is something like this. We have a machinist, a writer, and boldist. So if we think about the form in the meaning and the context, we have two of these suffixes that seem to have the same meaning. Machinist and writer seems to both have some sort of meaning that relates to one who writes, one who works with machines, or one who works on machines, something like that. There's a one who, so there's a similar meaning there. Would we say that, and there's the similar context, right? It's right there at the end and a suffix, but is it that similar? Write is a verb, machine is a noun, so maybe not. And if we look at the form, would we say that these forms are similar? No. So the ist and in English would be considered different morphemes, because although they both have a similar meaning of one who, they're not really used in the same context, and they're really not the same form. They're not the same morpheme. Now let's look at machinist and boldist. As I say it, they do have a consistent form, at least in sound, if not in spelling. So maybe it's consistent enough, similar enough in form. What about meaning? Does the ist in machinist and the ist in bold mean the same thing? Well, no. If machinist is one who works with machines, boldist is not one who is bold. It means the most bold. So there's a different meaning to that morpheme. And what about the context? Let's check that just to be sure. Again, machine is a noun, ist is a suffix that makes another noun. Bold is an adjective, and ist is a suffix that makes another adjective. So that's not the same context. We would want to find the same exact pattern to say that those were same morphemes. So what we would have there are three different morphemes, ist, and ist. And we would know that by looking at all three facets of the language: meaning, form, and context. So to wrap up, we now can revisit the definition that a morpheme is the smallest linguistic unit that carries meaning and serves a grammatical function. And we know that this means when we say it's the smallest linguistic unit, that it has to be the same unit in form, or at least very similar form, with the same meaning and the same use. And now I hope that we have explained the concept of morpheme, and you can apply these linguistic concepts of form, meaning, and use to identify separate or individual morphemes in English or in other languages. Linguistics, as the study of languages, come up with strategies to study the patterns not just in English but in all languages. And this concept term of morpheme is applicable to all languages, and this strategy that we just went over is applicable to determine what the morphemes are in all languages. Of course, in other languages you would have to know the meaning, which often requires us to have a translation, morpheme by morpheme translation, so that we can look for the consistencies, or at least have a translation of understanding the word so that we can break down the parts and compare for similar form, meaning, and context or use.